the Rude Awakening Tour podcast.
Seats, spark seats.
And so the reason I'm going on about this is I want to get to the point of what's the key point that we need to emphasize. So we're getting to that. We're almost there. The key point is this. It's not that you took Mefloquine. Don't emphasize that. Don't emphasize taking Mefloquine. What every veteran I've talked to has experienced. I have never spoken to a veteran who has claimed permanent disability from taking Mefloquine, and they report, "Oh, doc, I took Mefloquine when I was overseas. I took it every week faithfully. I never had any problem, and it was only 10 years later that I developed awful nightmares, depression, anxiety." I've never had a veteran say that. Why? Well, because that wouldn't be Mefloquine that caused that problem, right? Every single veteran who's claiming disability from Mefloquine is reporting what? They're reporting symptoms during use of the drug. The very symptoms that are listed in the product insert as requiring the immediate discontinuation of the drug. So the exposure of interest is not that you were given Mefloquine. That's not important. Well, it is important in the sense that you wouldn't be in this situation if we had used Mefloquine. But the problem was not that, well, the problem was that you were given Mefloquine in the first place. It was fundamentally defective for the indication it was developed for, but let's just put that aside. We are all here today because you took Mefloquine and you experienced symptoms during your use of the drug. And in most cases, you were told, instead of being told correctly, you must immediately discontinue the drug. Instead, you were told, ignore those warnings, don't pay them any attention, continue taking the drug. You were involuntarily intoxicated. So the exposure of interest is, in many cases, prolonged involuntary intoxication with the drug, exposure to the drug in a prolonged manner contrary to the very warnings of the drug's manufacturer. Not every veteran will have experienced those particular circumstances, but you did. So we need a term for this. I have termed this symptomatic exposure. So all of the studies that I've cited, right, all of the studies that their experts will hold up as proof that Mefloquine is harmless, what is the exposure that they will cite? What is the exposure that they will use in these studies? Not symptomatic exposure. It's just, oh, well, these veterans took the drug. That is irrelevant to this issue, right? We know that many people will take the drug and not experience any symptoms during use. They are at no risk of lasting disability. Zero, none, as far as we know. For the purposes of this argument, I will concede that they're at zero risk of permanent disability. The risk of disability comes from being involuntarily intoxicated. Taking the drug and experiencing symptoms and being told, ignore those symptoms, keep taking the drug. Symptomatic exposure. And there isn't, with the exception of one study that conveniently the other side chooses to ignore, with the exception of one study, all of the other studies that have been published do not ask the correct question. They don't ask, all right, veterans, of you veterans who are being seen in our psychiatric facility, how many of you took Mefloquine and experienced psychiatric symptoms during use? That would be the correct exposure. We'll put you in one box and we'll study your outcomes, and then everyone else who either didn't take Mefloquine or who took Mefloquine and didn't experience symptoms, we'll put you in another box and we'll follow you and we'll see who has more problems. Had they done that, had they done those studies, had they taken, let's say, a unit, a brigade-sized unit deploying to Somalia, 1,000 or so people deploying to Somalia, and they'd said, all right, of you folks, of you 1,000 folks, who took Mefloquine and experienced symptoms? Okay, there's about 100. All right, take a look at you over here. How many of you took Mefloquine, didn't have any problems, or took another anti-malarial? There might be 900, right? Follow those, right? Of the 100 that took Mefloquine and experienced symptoms, right? How many of those might today go on to be disabled? We all know from personal experience, don't we? Right? I mean, if you can go back in time and you can think about your unit and you think of those who experience nightmares and anxiety and so on, a good number of those folks are still suffering those symptoms today. It's not a trivial number. It's a sizable percentage. What precise percentage it is, we could perhaps discuss at some point in the future, but it's not trivial. It's not a small number. It's a significant percentage, right? And then you have to, and now we might say, well, it's 100%. Some people might say it's 100%, and I'm sympathetic to that perspective. If you're experiencing symptoms during use of Mefloquine, and particularly if they're quite pathognomonic symptoms, like the really weird nightmares, or the confusion, or psychotic-like symptoms, if you've experienced those symptoms acutely, in my experience, there's a very, very, very good chance you will be permanently disabled from those, particularly the confusion. But for argument's sake, let's just say there are some people that will experience those symptoms and not be completely disabled. The real question is, are you at greater risk of disability, all-cause psychiatric disability, if you're in that group versus being in the group that didn't? That's the type of study that needs to be done. That's the type of question that we need to be asking, right? And thus far, the government is claiming that you are not entitled to disability, you are not entitled to benefits, you are not entitled to a victory in your suit because there isn't scientific evidence. Well, they're not asking the right scientific questions, because the exposure of interest is not, did you take Mefloquine? The exposure of interest is, did you take Mefloquine and experience psychiatric symptoms? It would be as if the tobacco companies, in trying to defend against lawsuits, studied a whole bunch of tobacco retailers, right? People behind the counter at convenience stores, and said, look, these people have had 50 years of exposure to cigarettes. They're picking up the cigarette packs off the shelf and they're handing them to the customers. These people have had 50 years of continuous exposure to cigarettes, and not one of them has developed lung cancer. So therefore, no one can say that cigarettes cause lung cancer. That's what the government is saying. They're saying they have all of these studies, and they have brilliant professors from Ivy League colleges that are experts in their field who have said that there's no evidence at all that Mefloquine causes chronic disability. They are looking at the wrong exposure. They're looking at the wrong exposure. Okay, so this brings me to my point. The elevator speech. What is the elevator speech? We need to be screening veterans for symptomatic exposure to Mefloquine. We need to be asking the question. We need to be sending out letters to veterans. We need to be putting messages out on the radio. We need to be telling doctors to screen their patients. We need to ask them the question, hey, you were a veteran that was at risk of exposure to Mefloquine, because starting with the Somalia campaign, well, actually even a few years before in Canada, we were using this drug that has potentially catastrophic effects on your mental health. So we need to be identifying those folks that could have been affected by the drug. So we need a targeted campaign, reaching out and identifying these veterans. How are we going to be doing it? We need to ask the question, hey, have you taken Mefloquine? And during use of the drug, did you experience psychiatric symptoms such as anxiety, depression, restlessness, and confusion? And if so, if you've had that history of symptomatic exposure, you need to go see a doctor. We need to sit down and take a detailed history. We need to learn more about when these symptoms started, when you were given the drug, what warnings you were given, right? What information were you given? And how did your symptoms evolve? And what have your symptoms been previously attributed to, right? Oh, you've been diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. Let's go through your history and see if that diagnosis makes sense in light of what we now know. Let me ask you about your dreams. Are you having nightmares about this combat incident that happened while you were in Somalia? Oh, no. Your nightmares began before deployment, and they were of monsters at the foot of the bed attacking you, and that's what you were afraid of? And while you were deployed, even though you saw some bad things, you actually hallucinated even worser things? You see? If all we do as a community is get the medical community and the government to acknowledge the importance of symptomatic exposure and have some sort of targeted outreach so that those folks can be identified, called in, and asked questions, I guarantee you this problem will be solved in a month. Because what will happen is all the psychiatrists that have been dealing with complex patients that they can't understand, that they can't figure out, the cases that have gone on to be called complex PTSD or whatever, the cases that have been attributed to personality disorder, or this disorder or that disorder, the folks that have 20 different diagnoses in their charts. If the psychiatrists go through this process, if the nurses go through this process, if the folks at the VA go through this process and identify their complex cases and realize that a large number of these complex cases have this consistent history of symptomatic mefloquine exposure, then we're done. Because the community will immediately recognize this as a problem. And then you're going to see doctors come out of the woodwork with research proposals and case reports and studies. They'll, even in the absence of government funding, they will do the work themselves because it will have clicked by then. It's really that simple. So you asked me many moons ago, I'm sorry I'm rambling, but you asked me, what is the one message? What is you have 30 seconds in an elevator with someone, right? A policymaker or something. What we have to do is we need, and you don't even need the government to acknowledge this is a problem. You just need them to accept the screening, right? The same way we screen veterans for TBI, the same way we screen veterans for history of military sexual trauma, I hope we do, the same way we screen veterans for PTSD symptoms and depression symptoms. We need to start screening appropriate cohorts of veterans for a history of symptomatic mefloquine exposure. Our group, the Quinism Foundation, we have a simple 2-question screening survey, which is in the public domain. It can be used. There are other ways to do it. But essentially, all the government needs to do is get the veteran community to be screened with 2 questions. Hey, did you ever take mefloquine? Small round white pill, smaller than dime, right? Taken once a week. Did you take that pill? Yes. Okay. During use, did you experience insomnia, nightmares, sleep disturbance, anxiety, depression, restless? Yes. If you answer yes to both questions, you need to be brought in and have a sit-down interview with someone that'll get to the bottom of your mefloquine. That's it. So, bottom line, what do we need? What's the elevator speech? We need the government to mandate and fund and acknowledge the need to screen the veteran population for a history of symptomatic mefloquine exposure. Done. That's it.
Nice.
Yeah.
It doesn't seem that complicated.
It doesn't seem that complicated. And here's the problem. If now they know our plan, so they're not going to do it. Unfortunately, I've just given away the plan. But the reason they probably don't want to do this is because they know what I know, that if they do this, then it will be so obvious, right? Because think about it. Think about the population of veterans that you might be going to psychiatry clinic with, or that you might be seen in clinic with. All the mefloquine veterans would screen positive to that kind of instrument, wouldn't they? And all the veterans that really aren't having the same kind of problems, they would, right? I mean, that's it. Pretty much everyone who in this room who considers themselves disabled by mefloquine would screen positive on that instrument. Raise your hand. Yeah, right? Yeah, so there you go. I mean, that's pretty much all we need to do. So if we had one request, if I had the Secretary of Defense or the Secretary of the VA, or that former colleague of mine who was worried about bankrupting the government, if I had one wish from one of those people, I would say we need to implement some sort of universal program of screening for symptomatic mefloquine exposure.
Perfect.
Yeah.
I think we're going to take a short break, but we'll do a couple more questions first for sure. Go ahead, please.
We've identified the what, we've identified the why.
Yeah.
Maybe I'm jumping the gun for this period, but many veterans either designated PTSD, anxiety, depression,
Yep.
have been infected by the mefloquine.
Mhm.
How do we treat it? Because
Right.
getting medical assistance, especially in this day and age, we have trouble getting doctors
Right.
that'll see us.
Right.
So
Yeah.
how do we help
Right.
our brothers and sisters?
Yeah. Well,
treat this ourselves?
Good question, thank you.
The simple answer is I don't know. I as a doctor, as a scientist, I can't tell you based on any sort of reasonable evidence. I can't give you an answer. And that's because I don't want to. I have my suspicions, and I can share what other people have told me may work. But that's different. As a scientist and as a doctor, I can't tell you. And let me explain the reason why I can't
No,
tell you.
I understand it's a case by case.
Well,
scenario
it
as well, but
probably would.
there are similarities.
So let me briefly explain how we go about developing treatments for conditions. Okay, so well, in the old days, doctors would just try lots of stuff, right? They would just throw a lot of stuff against the wall, hoping something would stick, right? They would experiment on their patients in the hopes that maybe something would stick, and then they would develop personal experience with something that seems to work a little better, and they would do that on more and more patients, and then either it was actually truly effective and they were correct, or they might just fool themselves into thinking that it was working, or maybe it was just a natural progression of the disease getting better on its own, and they would attribute the improvement to the drug. That was a very unscientific way of developing treatments. Today, the way we develop treatments is we use appropriate scientific epidemiological methods to test a proposed treatment against something like a placebo that we would not expect to have any benefits. And the difference in efficacy between the placebo and the purported treatment is the degree of benefit of that drug. So, and how we do that is we take people with the disease, right? We find, let's say, 100 people with PTSD, let's say, and we give half of them at random some treatment. Let's say MDMA, right? And then we'll use something novel, MDMA. And then we give the other half, the other 50 who have been selected at random, we give them I don't know, a sugar pill or something, something that's not expected to have any effect.
We'll see.
And we don't tell them what they got. Now, if you got MDMA, you probably know you got MDMA, right? Hopefully. So, ignoring the fact that you might be unblinded to your treatment because it's so obvious, the ideal kind of drug treatment study is one where you take a whole bunch of people with the disease and you randomize them into two groups, typically. Two groups, one half that gets the intervention, the other half, roughly, that doesn't. And you just follow them for a month or a year or 10 years or whatever, and you just count how many get better in the treatment group versus how many get better in the non-treatment group. And if a whole bunch more in the treatment group get better, a whole bunch more, because it might just be luck, if a whole bunch more get better in the treatment group, then you can say, looks like the drug works, right? So we're not yet at the point where we can do that, right? It's hard enough doing that well, even for existing diseases. PTSD, for example, it's actually pretty hard to develop really convincing evidence that this treatment does well. For example, MDMA. They tried to get that licensed in the States to treat PTSD, and they did studies kind of like that, and the FDA said, we're not really convinced, we're going to put approving this on hold for a while. So it's really difficult to do studies of this nature well. But a prerequisite for doing a study of this nature, a prerequisite for doing a study where the doctor could say at the end, hey, look, I've looked at the data, I've read the paper, this drug is going to work, I think. There's a good chance this drug is going to work. And, I'm reasonably sure it's pretty safe, too. To get to that point, we have to do these studies first. And a prerequisite to doing that study is having a definition of the disease such that you can put an ad out in the paper or whatever and get 100 people with the disease to come in and do the study, right? So at this point, we're not at the stage yet where, let's say somebody gave me $1 million. Well, with inflation, $5 million. $1 million, no. Will that even get you a condo here in town?
Yeah.
So $10 million. $10 million. So, Dr. Nevin, here's $10 million. Do a study on some veterans. Figure out if ketamine works for Mefloquine, let's just say, right? Okay, I would need to get 100 veterans with Mefloquine poisoning. Now, I know a veteran with Mefloquine poisoning, or Mefloquine encephalopathy, or Kunis. I personally know how to identify those veterans. I feel good about that. But I would need to be able to convince my colleagues in the medical community that I know how to do that. And that would require some consensus, not just me saying it. It would require some consensus within the medical community that, okay, yes, this is a recognized disease entity and these are the diagnostic criteria and so on. And, at this point, I might get some doctors agreeing and so on. But we really want strong consent. We don't want it to be a contentious issue in the medical community. We want the medical community to be fully on board, understanding that this is a true disease entity and these are the diagnostic criteria. I spell it. So we're not there yet, you see. So if someone gave me $10 million now, I might be able to do a study on some of the veterans in this room and maybe some more, and then do a study of that nature. But the problem is that would be putting the cart before the horse. Most likely, people would view that as putting the cart before the horse, because I would be doing that without consensus in the literature and consensus in the community of what constitutes a case of mefloquine poisoning. You see?
But somebody has to go first.
Somebody has to go first, right? And okay.
Hey?
There are
You're old enough
instances.
to rock the boat now.
There are instances where really stubborn doctors that are just frustrated at the pace of progress in the medical community have basically done it all themselves, right? They've come up with case definition, and they've started the treatment protocols, and they've done the science and so on. And occasionally that does work. Occasionally it does work. But I suppose maybe I could be faulted for not doing that myself at this early stage. I don't have $10 million. If someone gives me $10 million, I'll reconsider. But I don't have that. But
When I win the lottery,
well, yeah. But I think here's what I think. I think it would be better. My personal opinion is that I think it would be better if other doctors, if others in the medical community saw the benefits of this, realized for themselves, hey, wait a second, we have a problem. There are a lot of veterans with this weird constellation of signs and symptoms. They seem to have this history of symptomatic exposure that we've identified through the screening program that I just described. And it would be a lot better if, instead of just crazy old Dr. Nevin, who, according to them has a chip on his shoulder, or he's just out there, or whatever they're going to say, it would be, instead of it being me, it would be better, I think, if there was some completely independent doctor that came to the same conclusions as me and decided to do this study themselves, because it would be a lot more difficult to dismiss those findings, wouldn't it? So science is one of those things where, it's said that science progresses one funeral at a time, and what they mean by that is that it isn't enough for one doctor to make a finding and have it be convincing and compelling and meet all of the standards of evidence and publish it. That's not enough. The old guard sort of needs to be replaced with a new generation of people that see the problem differently. And so it's usually not just one person, it's a new generation of doctors coming in. And I really do think that it's been enough time passed since mefloquine has been the subject of all of this manufactured doubt. I really do think there's the opportunity for a new generation of psychiatrists and pharmacologists and so on to become interested in mefloquine poisoning or quinism as a disease entity and study it independently without any sort of input from me or some of the others that have maybe laid some of the foundations for this. And I really do think that I mentioned earlier that if we were to simply screen the veteran community for this history of symptomatic exposure, I think that would be enough of a catalyst for people to independently propose treatment protocols of the type that I've just described. I really do, because this is such a large target. It's such a juicy, low-hanging fruit, and I really do think it just needs the smallest of catalysts for it to happen. Now, I don't want to get your hopes up. If we were to get the Prime Minister to acknowledge this tomorrow, right, or the next Prime Minister to acknowledge this tomorrow, and just do one thing and commit to having Canadian veterans screen for this, and that creates enough of a spark in the clinical community that they recognize this is a plausible cause of the problem, enough that they propose tentative case diagnostic criteria for the disorder, and then immediately start treatment protocols. If everything goes well, it'll still be 5 years or more before they might identify a treatment that could potentially be licensed for use in this, right? That's a very slow process. I think when PTSD was first accepted as a diagnostic entity in 1980, I think it was the better part of 15 to 20 years, if I'm not mistaken. I believe it was the mid-90s until the first pharmaceutical underwent a trial for treatment. And I think we would shave a significant amount of time off that, but it's not an immediate sort of thing. Okay, so now that, in the interim, what could we do? And we'll talk about that maybe after the break.
Yeah.
Okay. So the rabbit hole. If you've studied this issue for any length of time, once you recognize the facts, once you identify, wait, something doesn't make sense here. How could they have continued to use this drug, knowing what we now know? They must have known this. How and why could they have continued to use this drug? There are many possible explanations, and of course we would need to talk to the people that made the decisions to know precisely, right? So all we're left with is speculative. This is all speculative. And because these decisions were made so long ago, the people that actually know the answers to these questions they may not be with us much longer. And so we may never know for certain, unless there's some sort of documentary evidence that explains why these decisions were made. I don't know if this is the right forum to go down this rabbit hole today, but I think what you'll realize is that once you get to that point where you recognize, wait a second, we've known all along that this drug can have these effects, that it predictably makes large numbers of soldiers deploying to war zones. It predictably makes non-trivial, significant fractions of these soldiers, many of whom might be expected to be conscripts, right, with little interest in deploying to war zones. This drug, probably from the earliest days of its development in the 60s, during the height of the draft, during the war in Vietnam, should have been reasonably anticipated to have predictably led to the development of symptoms such as heightened awareness to threat, less propensity to require sleep, greater propensity to staying awake, and therefore potentially being more functional as a soldier, right? Higher propensity towards seeing danger in things, so paranoia. Paranoia is the unreasonable recognition of or sense of danger in things that might not otherwise be dangerous. A useful symptom to have in a war zone, right? The drug at the time, in the 60s and in the 70s, as it was being developed, it would have been reasonably, this drug would have, based on what was known about other drugs of the class at this point, it would have been reasonably known that this drug could have caused increased aggression, including in otherwise unaggressive, peaceful people, and violent ideation. Right? All of this was or ought to have been reasonably known during the drug's development. This is very obvious if you study this issue at any length. And so the question will naturally come up. Knowing all of the potential dangers of this drug, all of these adverse symptoms of the drug, insomnia, anxiety, paranoia, aggression, violent ideation, why would the military that is sending conscripts that might not otherwise want to fight or be in a war zone, why would the military possibly want to use a drug that has all of these effects? And if you think about it for any length of time, you have your answer. And that is deeply disturbing, right? And the consequences of this line of thought are very disturbing. So much so that you naturally just want to dismiss this whole line of inquiry and attribute all of this to just a coincidence. It is otherwise highly coincidental that all of these symptoms occur predictably in people given this drug deploying to war zones where at least some of these symptoms might be adaptive, right? It could be merely coincidental. Or there could be more to it than that. And in addition to all of these symptoms being quite convenient coincidences, it could also simply be that the military, full of experts, top minds that have been studying this drug and its effects for many decades, it could very well be the case that not only are these symptoms coincidentally potentially very adaptive in military environments, it's also potentially that the military simply just completely negligent and just didn't know what they were doing in administering this drug. That's a possibility. The other possibility is that there was some degree of intentionality to all of this. That these to some degree are not all side effects. And this is not pure speculation to say this. There's actually there's a fairly strong paper trail suggesting that the military was not only aware of the specific psychiatric effects of this class of drug, dating back to at least the 1940s, but that certain government agencies took a particular interest in these side effects. And during various programs in the 50s and 60s, actually, there's documentation of this. They actually did fairly large-scale experiments on unwitting members of the public into these effects. And so just to come right out and say it, we all know MK Ultra. We associate MK Ultra with the CIA doing experiments with LSD, the hallucinogen LSD, on unwitting members of the public. This is well established. Your government, well, my government, the U.S., for reasons that elude me, felt it was in the national interest to give unwitting members of the public LSD to see how they responded, thinking that LSD could be weaponized by the communists and needing to defend against, these potential effects. Less well known is that, and this is not speculative. This is well known. There's actually published literature on this. The CIA also spent funds in that program investigating drugs of this class, the anti-malarial quinolene class. There was actually a research center constructed in Georgetown, staffed by a certain Professor Geschichter from Georgetown. And he testified during the Church Committee hearings into the origins of MK Ultra and so on. And he described during Senate testimony that during the Second World War, during the anti-malarial drug discovery program that was developing a bunch of quinolene anti-malarials, that the precursor to the CIA, the OSS, noticed the psychosis and confusion-inducing effects of drugs of that class. And I believe the words were took a particular interest in that. And so it stands to reason that the anti-malarial quinolenes, because of the ostensible alternative use of these drugs, right? This was not a truth serum. This was an anti-malarial, right? We're giving it to help you, right? So there's plausible deniability of the use of this drug in alternative settings. It's right there in black and white that they studied this class of drug ostensibly for other reasons. I believe the cover story was that they were studying for treatment of asthma. But as Geschichter admitted it during Senate testimony, that they were interested in studying this drug for its behavioral effects, this class of drug for its behavioral effects. So it stands to reason that there was some knowledge of these effects during the subsequent development of Mefloquine, which is chemically very similar to this class of drug. And so one possibility, and this is all speculative, and who knows whether or not this is true or not, but it's not completely implausible that there was some interest in the development of this class of drug, ostensibly for its antimalarial effects, but to one degree or another, to some degree or another, for the behavioral effects that it would have, particularly those that might be somewhat beneficial in times of war. Right? It sounds crazy. If we sit back and we think, my God, could they have actually done that? Right? Could a democratic government have actually knowingly developed a drug ostensibly for use as an antimalarial, with knowledge that they've hid that this drug would have effects that might plausibly improve the warfighting ability of those that it was given to. That's deeply disturbing to contemplate. But it's not crazy, right? It is entirely plausible, and there's significant evidence, significant documentary evidence to suggest this might actually have been what they were thinking all along. Now, I had come to this conclusion several times myself, thinking, well, this is the only thing that makes sense. And I had dismissed it on numerous occasions, thinking, there's no way they would ever have done this. This is ridiculous.
Pretty dark.
It's dark. But you have to think about the context. You know, the Cold War was an existential period of threat for our country. And what didn't the government do in the name of national security? What didn't they do, right? And we're learning more and more and more about the depths of depravity that our government sank to notionally defend us against our enemies, which were much worse. So nothing surprises me. Nothing surprises me. And I realize now that compared to some other things, this is actually not that far out into left field. Now, what convinced me that this was not that far out in left field was when I learned that the military was using this drug ostensibly as an antimalarial on detainees that were being brought into Guantanamo. And what was very interesting is that the government was saying, well, we're giving this drug as an antimalarial to these detainees coming into Guantanamo because we don't want them to, be sick with malaria or potentially transmit malaria to other people. And superficially, this seems to make sense. And superficially, it seems like, oh, well, we're just trying to help them. We're giving them this antimalarial to help them. They're coming from all these areas that are infected with malaria, and so we want to give them big doses of mefloquine to treat them presumptively so that they can, enjoy their subsequent torture in good health, right? I mean, that's basically what they're saying, right? We're about to torture these detainees, but, because we care so much about them, we're going to give them this treatment dose of mefloquine so that they can not suffer the inconvenience of, of fever and, other unpleasant symptoms, so that they can enjoy being tortured in good health. And they were subject to torture. They were subject to what they described as enhanced interrogation. In the immediate aftermath of being welcomed to Guantanamo with a dose of methadone. Now, what we know is that if you give someone, I mentioned earlier that if you give someone one tablet of mefloquine every week, a certain percentage will have these unpleasant symptoms. But if you give much more mefloquine at one time, a predictably larger proportion of the population will experience the symptoms. So what I was alluding to earlier was not all of you might experience dizziness or nausea or anxiety or paranoia or confusion with one dose a week. But if I give you 4 tablets all at once, or if I give you 5 tablets all at once, or if I give you 6 tablets all at once, which is the treatment dose of malaria, if I give you 6 tablets all at once, let's say, or 5 tablets all at once, then there's a very good chance the majority of people given that dose will experience these symptoms, right? And isn't it convenient, or isn't it a coincidence? Again, these coincidences. Isn't it a coincidence? If you look through the torture memos, the memos legally justifying torture, they don't call it torture. We call it torture. They don't call it torture, because if they call it torture, they'd be in jail. They call it enhanced interrogation, and they say it's not torture. But if you look through the memorandum justifying these measures, they say, look, yes, we were trying to make them anxious. Yes, we were trying to make them paranoid. Yes, we were trying to deprive them of sleep. We were trying to do all of these things so that they would squeal, right? We were trying to make them lose touch with reality. We were trying to make them paranoid. We were essentially trying to induce symptoms of psychosis in these people. Now, we care about them. We didn't want them to be sick while they were enjoying this treatment, so we gave them this drug. And yes, by making them stand up and drizzling them with water and waterboarding them and all of this stuff, we were trying to induce all of these symptoms in the hopes that they would squeal, so that they would, fly another jet into another building. Isn't it a coincidence isn't it a remarkable coincidence that the drug that we just happened to have given a few days earlier is known to cause those exact same symptoms? Okay, so that may very well be, but they will say, well, look, these people were picked up in areas that were endemic for malaria, so we had to do this. We had no other choice. Well, if you really look into the medical rationale behind giving people treatment doses of Mefloquine, even when there's no evidence at all that they have malaria, you'll see that this rationale that they've offered for the use of this drug completely breaks down. I wrote a paper about this. You can find it on my website. I go through the military's explanation, their justification for why they use Mefloquine on these detainees, and it makes no sense. It makes absolutely no sense. And if it was just some junior doctor at the Pentagon that came up with this treatment program, I would say, well, they just don't know what they're doing, and I could just dismiss it as ignorance. But it wasn't some junior doctor. It was, these protocols were developed at the highest levels of the Department of Defense. It was literally written by a doctor in the Pentagon, right? These people are not chosen to that position because they're amateurs and they don't know what they're doing. These people don't make mistakes. They don't make mistakes. The people that are writing these orders in the Pentagon, you cannot ascribe errors like this to ignorance. You can't. Because if that level of ignorance was operating at the Pentagon with any degree of regularity, we would all be dead in a thermonuclear holocaust. Like, we would all be dead. The world would not be here. These people don't make mistakes like that. These people are professionals. So it was only after the Pentagon responded to questions about their use of Mefloquine at Guantanamo that I said, wait a second, this is a tell. Like, this does not make sense. And so at that point, I reluctantly came to the conclusion that there actually might be more to this. That they very well might have developed this drug in the aftermath of what was known as MK-Ultra, which became MK-Search. MK-Ultra was a program that was broadly interested in looking into drugs and interventions that could have any arbitrary behavioral effect on people, both for offensive and defensive purposes. We know this. This is clear as day. It was concluded at the end of MK-Ultra that there was no magic truth serum, that there was no clear way to have any sort of obvious behavioral effect on people. LSD certainly wouldn't work. But there are documents that escaped the shredder in the 70s that said, with the exception of, essentially, that said words to the effect of, with the exception of a certain class of drug, which we will continue to study, which may have benefits in interrogation, this program has not proven useful. And so the successor to MK-Ultra is known as MK-Search. And that was terminated around the time of the Church Committee hearings. And during the Church Committee hearings, the CIA said, all right, the days of unwitting experimentation of drugs of this nature is over. We are no longer going to be experimenting on behavior control or interrogation drugs on unwitting volunteers. From now on, we're only going to be doing these experiments on witting volunteers. And this escaped notice by the committee. And you have to ask yourself, who on earth would willingly volunteer for experiments of behavior control drugs? Do you know what was going on at that time? The Walter Reed Army Institute of Research was conducting the initial human experiments on Mefloquine, on college volunteers who were witting volunteers. So it's entirely possible that oh, and what else is interesting is that there were a number of authors who were involved in research into the antimalarial quinolines during the World War II era. A handful of authors, very high up, well-published authors. They all mysteriously stopped publishing around the time MK-Ultra started. They stopped publishing. They just went dark. And then they restarted publishing when MK-Search ended and the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research Malaria Drug Development Program started up. But now what were they doing during those other years? We don't know. We don't know because they didn't publish. But they had advanced considerably in government during those times and advanced to have very prestigious positions in various jurisdictions around the country, including facilities that had received funding during MK-Ultra. So there's a lot of corroborating evidence, right? But I'll readily concede that this is very speculative and a lot of it's circumstantial. But I don't think we can completely exclude the possibility that Mefloquine owes its existence to, at some level, and well hidden by most of the people within the government, that the drug owes its existence to a continuous effort dating to World War II to investigate this class of drug primarily for its behavioral effects, for national security purposes, and that particular interest was taken in this drug because of its ostensible use as an antimalarial that would be used in circumstances where the adverse effects could easily be attributed to other causes, thus preserving plausible deniability. It makes sense, doesn't it? And if the U.S. military had been so eager to make use of this drug as a adjunct to its torture of Guantanamo detainees, we would have never figured it out. But they just couldn't help themselves. You know, it's often been said that when the U.S. military develops a measure or a countermeasure, right? They develop a death ray. They develop, some truth serum. They develop any sort of weapon. These people can't help themselves. They're going to use it. They can't help themselves. There's nothing that the intelligence community or the military has developed that they don't use at some point. They can't help themselves. And so I think this may have been the only time they did this, right? Because I can't think of another reason why they might have used high doses of Mefloquine as an adjunct to torture to try to get the truth out of people. But I think they, just like kids in a candy store, just couldn't help themselves. Now, could I be wrong? I mean, it's very easy to say, oh, Dr. Nevin, we're going to dismiss everything you say because you're a tinfoil hat wearing, Alex Jones watcher, right? But if you really think about it, there is a lot of supporting documentation behind this, and more importantly, this answers the question, right? Make this make sense, right? Because what will inevitably happen if you study this issue long enough is you will say this doesn't make any sense. Why would they continue using this drug? We had Malaran, we had Tobacone pro bono available in 2001. Why didn't we just use this, right? Okay, now here's the thing. Military's approach says, why are you giving Mefloquine to these detainees at Guantanamo? It's 2006, 2007. Why are you still giving Mefloquine to these people? This is a dangerous drug. Well, at that point, we were still using Mefloquine in our troops overseas. So what's the Pentagon's response? Don't be silly. This drug is so safe, we're still giving it to our troops. This can't be a drug designed to enhance interrogation. We're giving it to our own troops. Don't be silly. Right? So this is an example of acceptable collateral damage. Right? We all know that during the Cuban Missile Crisis, the top generals were openly discussing shooting down aircraft and blaming it on the Cubans. Right? We all know this. For those Americans watching, your government was more than willing to kill you and blame it on the enemy to justify the invasion of Cuba. This is what your government has done and will do. They're probably still doing it, right? We don't know. So does it come as any surprise that this drug's existence and use in military settings might, to some degree, have been motivated for reasons other than what they are telling you? Right? Doesn't it all make a lot more sense now? It does. It makes a lot more sense now. And so now, I'm also often asked, Dr. Nevin, why won't they just admit it? Why won't they just admit that this drug is dangerous? Here's another possible explanation. I mentioned the torture memos, right? So what we did to those detainees, and I'm not a fan of any of those detainees, okay, with certain exceptions. I'm sympathetic to a few, but there are some bad people that we rounded up. And I'm not all that interested in whether we should keep them in jail or not. I'm sympathetic to both sides. However, that being said, what I'm not sympathetic to, violations of the law, right? The government has acknowledged torture is illegal. We do not torture, right? Waterboarding doesn't count as torture because it's not so bad, and it doesn't cause any. What does the government say? It doesn't cause permanent damage, right? And in the memos themselves, in the torture memos that justify enhanced interrogation, the government relies singularly upon the defense that nothing that they did caused permanent damage. So, and these people are still alive, right? So
You track down Omar Khadr?
So the people that were responsible for ordering the various measures that we all recognize as torture, the reason they're not in jail, the reason they're not being prosecuted, like certain ex-presidents, right? The reason they're escaping prosecution is that they are relying upon this defense, that this was all just temporary effects. Does this sound familiar?
Yeah.
Does this sound familiar? So isn't it interesting? Isn't it convenient? Now, all of these Guantanamo detainees that were tortured, they were also given treatment doses of mefloquine, which drug regulators will now concede at those doses can and does cause permanent damage. Now, if they concede that they gave the drug in any way as an adjunct to torture, then that would be basically admitting that they're guilty of torture, right? So they're not going to admit that. But if it can be shown, that the psychiatric effects of mefloquine, that I think very credibly can be seen to have been the motivation for the use of mefloquine in this context, right? If it can be shown that they knew or ought to have known that any of those psychiatric effects would be permanent, that some of the detainees that now have chronic anxiety, that have been diagnosed with PTSD, that committed suicide in the aftermath of taking mefloquine and having been tortured, if it can be shown that there was known permanence to these effects and that the drug was given as an adjunct to torture, then there are a handful of senior U.S. officials in the intelligence community and the Defense Department that are guilty as day of torture, right? And so their friends at the highest levels of government are not going to throw them under the bus by saying, oh yeah, that drug that my buddy gave detainees at Guantanamo, we acknowledge is capable of causing permanent effects, right? That may very well be one of many reasons why senior officials are reluctant to concede the permanence of these effects, because then it would open a can of worms related to the use of the drug at Guantanamo. Now, I pointed out this very unusual use of the drug at Guantanamo many years ago, and I pointed out to members of the military community, I pointed out to members of the travel medicine community, all of which, senior folks, very high levels, have connections to the government, and they've all just been quiet. There's been crickets. No one wants to talk about this, right? But you eventually, and I've even tried to, I've approached the Muslim advocacy community, I've approached the Guantanamo advocacy community about this, and I've laid out this argument, and maybe I'm wrong because they're not paying much attention to my argument as well, but I do believe my argument has merit. I've really tried to study it for weaknesses, and I've really tried to study it for, am I just being paranoid here? Like, am I overreading things? But there's really very little other explanation for this that makes sense. The only other explanation is just massive incompetence plus coincidence, right? You have massive incompetence by people at a very high level within the Department of Defense, accompanied by extraordinarily convenient and coincidental effects resulting from that incompetence that benefit them. If only we could all be so lucky that our mistakes end up helping us, right? So anyway, so that's just the beginning of the rabbit hole. But there's many more levels. But a lot more of the rabbit holes are very speculative. But that's the most corroborated, interesting argument that I have, and that has allowed me to make sense of historical events in a context that is coherent and that makes sense. It's disturbing that our government might be engaged in that sort of thing, but we all know that Kennedy was not shot by the man in the window at the Texas Book Repository, right? We have a leading candidate for president of the United States that says, actually, no, it was the CIA. They killed my uncle, right? We know that Kennedy was not killed by a random weirdo. He was killed by the government. We know this. This everyone in America knows this, right? So if they're capable of doing that, right? And maybe they thought they were doing the right thing. You know, I mean, I read a book about Kennedy during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the military really did think they were dealing with a kid that didn't know what he was doing, and the military and the CIA really thought that this guy was going to get us all killed, and they really thought that they needed to take over. Like if you study the history of that time, and this is all context, right? Because the world was about to get destroyed, and you had all these generals and people at top levels of government that were dealing with this guy Kennedy, that this idealistic crazy guy from Massachusetts, rich playboy who was having sex with all his secretaries. They couldn't stand the guy, right? Of course they wanted to, right? So these people were trying to protect the country from the evil communists, and they were willing to kill Americans to unite the public behind a war. They were willing to do all sorts of bad things. So why wouldn't they do this little Mefloquine thing on the side? It's trivial. It's trivial and inconsequential compared to a lot of the other stuff that we know they did. And viewed in the context of Cold War era trickery, it's really, I mean, as bad as this is to all the people involved, in the grand scheme of things, it's actually not that big of a deal compared to a lot of the other stuff they did.
Fair enough.
I mean, as bad as this is, it really isn't when you think about it.
I'm going to divert you now.
Yeah.
Oh, we got a question first, and then I get to divert.
I have a burning question, you'll see my pond in a moment. I'm Hans from the Comox Valley. I served with old growth Bona back here, Dave Bona. And I waited 25 years to see Bona again, and I waited for 20 years to be at this event. Thank you, Doctor. Thank you for hosting this. My questions are, I've heard you mention it today, but it's going around in the veteran circle about in the chronic stages of mefloquine poisoning that mefloquine can burn the brainstem. And two-part question, and also in this blue chart that you say you don't 100% agree with, in the chronic stages of mefloquine poisoning, would that person encounter all these X's, including speech and skin rash and bowel disorder, or every person is different in how it manifests?
Okay, all right. So in fact, this is good because we can talk about
Diet.
yeah. Diet. Okay, let's talk about the medical term is pathophysiology. So what is the pathology? What is the problem with the body, with the organ systems? What is the dysfunction on a cellular and organ level that mefloquine causes that leads to all these symptoms? What is the pathophysiology in medical terms of mefloquine poisoning or quinism? And we'll call it chronic mefloquine encephalopathy for argument's sake. So we talked about encephalopathy. It's toxic encephalopathy caused by mefloquine. Mefloquine encephalopathy is chronic. It lasts more than 6 months. Chronic mefloquine encephalopathy. What's the pathophysiology or underlying disease process of chronic mefloquine encephalopathy? I don't know for sure, but all evidence points to this being the result of localized and I suspect relatively cell-specific neurotoxicity, meaning certain areas of the brain are affected, and the resulting effect is cell death, necrosis, cell death, in a somewhat random, localized, but also diffuse pattern. So, for example, we know that if people have a stroke, right, the blood vessels in the brain might get blocked off, and so a part of the brain, the cortex, might die, right? And you can see that on MRI or CT scan. You can see sort of a mushy part of the brain, and those people might not be able to move their arm. Let's say, like if it's this part of the brain, they might not be able to move this hand. It might go numb, right? So that's the pathophysiology of stroke is localized necrosis of the cortex in the distribution of a specific blood vessel, and the signs and symptoms are they match the area of the brain that's responsible for that, right? So with mefloquine, chronic mefloquine encephalopathy, what I suspect is going on is it isn't the outer part of the brain. It's not the cortex. It's not the part that controls our fine motor activity or motor sensation. The part of the brain that's affected is the brainstem. certain areas of the brainstem, and also the deep brain, the deep ancient part of the brain, which we'll call the limbic system. The limbic system. So, and there's good evidence that mefloquine and drugs like this target the limbic system, the emotional centers of the brain, and then the integrating parts of the brain that are responsible for all sorts of stuff that your brain does in the background, like controlling your blood pressure and keeping you balanced and controlling your vision, just all sorts of critical stuff that just allow us. I mean, it's really amazing. We can stand up on one foot, we can close our eyes, and we can keep our balance. Like, try to get a robot to do that, even. You know, like, it's pretty hard. So our brainstem does really good work. It's a hard working part of our brain, and it uses a lot of energy doing that. It's always working, even when we're sleeping. So I think mefloquine targets that part of the brain. So the pathophysiology of mefloquine encephalopathy, I think, is primarily limited to the brainstem and limbic system, and I think it's targeting certain areas that are responsible for like key critical functions. Key critical functions in the brainstem and limbic system: the emotional centers, the memory centers, the centers that control sleep and dreaming, and then further down the brainstem, areas that control, you know, such simple things as when you sleep, keeping your tongue out of the way. Like every time you breathe at night, your tongue gets out of the way, and then you breathe out, and then the tongue gets back in the way. So all this stuff is going on in the background, and mefloquine messes with all of that stuff. It messes with autonomic and key control centers in the brainstem in people that are affected. And unfortunately, the damage that drugs of this class do to those areas is too small to be seen on imaging. Like if you have a stroke, a huge area of your brain gets messed up and you can see it on the scan. But individual cells in your brain are microscopic, and we don't have imaging yet. We probably will soon. We don't have imaging yet that can do microscopic inspection of the brainstem. You know, the only way to see, we think, the damage that mefloquine does is to wait, unfortunately, until someone passes away, and then if we're fortunate enough to get the brain in time, you could potentially preserve it and do slices and stuff and look at the damage. And I'm confident that at some point in the future we'll actually see evidence of that in human cases. And please do not do what several veterans have done and call me up and say, Dr. Nevin, I'm about to commit suicide. Here's my address. I want to donate my brain to science. Please do not do that.
No.
Please do not do that. Because first of all, can't do that. It doesn't work. And second of all, just don't. We don't need that. We need mefloquine veterans to survive. We need you to be alive as a witness to this, so you can go to the House of Commons and Parliament and testify to your effects. Right? And you want to die an old man in your bed, comfortable with God at your side. You don't want to do that. And maybe in due course we can you know, because people get in car accidents and stuff all the time, and maybe in due course we can find a way to study these people's brains. It's the same way football players have been able to sort of do similar studies, where a handful of football players die early from just whatever reason, and they get them to the hospital fast enough, and they can do these sorts of studies. But this will require massive heroic effort, and it'll need to be coordinated at the highest levels of government. It'll need to be full court press to make this actually happen. It's very, very difficult, but it could happen. It could happen in the future. And when it does, if this does happen, I think what we'll see is that mefloquine causes this exact pattern of injury, similar to what was shown during the 1940s experiments by the government on monkeys that showed these effects, and that also showed the monkeys acting in psychotic, crazy ways, similar to how people act, which got the attention of the OSS, which led to these other developments. But anyway, so what is going on? So there's this multifocal, microscopic injury to certain critical emotional and control centers within the limbic system and brainstem. And damage of this nature results in not only a chronic dysfunction as a result of the damage, and because the brain is plastic, you can maybe get around that a little bit, right? But what damage of that nature can plausibly do is also contribute to seizure. It can serve as a focus or a nidus for a seizure, right? If you have a damaged part of your cortex, that might serve as a focus for abnormal electrical activity that could spread. So you get a grand mal seizure that leads to you shaking and jerking and having like a typical seizure that we all know. It's not the only kind of seizure that people can have. You can have what's called a temporal lobe seizure, which is a deep brain seizure. And that can be thought of as an emotional seizure. It's not precisely an emotional seizure, but it can be thought of as an emotional seizure. So someone who's having a temporal lobe seizure, they might just go quiet. They're not going to move. But they'll all of a sudden become very, they'll have violent thoughts, or they'll become psychotic. They may hear voices. They may sort of lose touch with reality for a few moments, and then they'll come back to reality, right? Or potentially in the midst of that seizure, they could go on to do pretty terrible things, like, for example, kill their family and burn the house down, like what happened to a poor kid out in Maine that was poisoned by Mefloquine on, I believe, a church trip while he was in college or high school. Came home and killed his family during what I assume was a temporal lobe type seizure event caused by Mefloquine. So this poor kid has been in jail now for many years. His family comes and visits occasionally, and family member told me a few years ago. He said, family member's doing pretty good in jail. He was having those spells still, even in jail. But then for reasons completely unrelated to his health state, related to Mefloquine, he decided to go on a diet. He decided he needed to lose some weight. He might have been on antipsychotics, and he might have gained a lot of weight from antipsychotic drugs. And so maybe someone in prison said, "Hey, you know what? You gotta go on keto. You gotta do the Atkins diet to lose some of that weight." When you're in prison, you got all the time in the world. So maybe he started working out. Maybe he started like strict keto diet, right? Do you know what happened? So the family reported to me that his symptoms completely resolved. Completely. Now, I don't know if he's had a relapse, but from what they described, this was essentially a cure. That he was able to see exactly what had happened. He knew he wasn't in control. He wasn't living in fear of having these episodes anymore. Like, for all intents and purposes, he was cured. Now, he was stuck in jail, obviously. Probably deserves to be there. Not much they can do about that. Short of alternative placement in an asylum or something like that. Maybe they can pardon him. I'm not sure, but sort of accepted his lot in life. But for all intents and purposes, cured, completely cured. And so the family asked, how can this make sense? Well, it does make sense in the context of, well, for example, what we know about pediatric epilepsy. So the earliest treatment for pediatric epilepsy, before we had all the drugs we have today, was basically ketosis, a ketone diet. So the doctors, I guess in the late 1800s, early 1900s, kids that had intractable epilepsy, they would say, do not eat any carbohydrates, pure ketosis, right? You just eat fat, protein and fat, nothing else. No carbs, zero carbs. And you can live on fats and proteins. You don't need carbs to live. You can, with the exception of when I, travel, I try to be on a ketonic diet because I think it's better. I enjoy the way I feel. My mind is sharper. I'm not always craving food. It's kind of like Ozempic, but without the $500 a month bill, or the list of side effects. Yeah, it's like nature's Ozempic when you're on an Atkins diet, and you're not giving money to the drug companies, which is also good because they control everything. Okay.
Can you just allude to, while you're on that, how, because the gastrointestinal issues tend to have people who are Mefloquine poisoned running to the toilet all the time, right? So you're always at the toilet. Well, that's all heading out the back door. So are all your good, feel-good serotonins and things, which are created in the gut. Hence that brain-gut connection I wanted.
Yeah. So I would say most veterans who are disabled as a result of, let's say, chronic Mefloquine encephalopathy, primarily are concerned at the neuropsychiatric effects. But there does seem to be this association with some other physical effects. I've pointed out sleep apnea. And for the longest time, I couldn't understand how sleep apnea, which is a physical obstruction to your airway at nighttime, how that could have possibly been caused by a drug that has predominantly neuropsychiatric effects. And then it occurred to me, of course, it just occurred to me one day, it's like you don't know what you don't know. But there is a part of the brainstem that, as I alluded to earlier, its job is to basically keep your tongue out of the way at night when you're breathing. And that's mediated by a simple process in the brainstem. And if you damage that area of the brainstem, you'll probably interfere with that process. And so you very well could develop obstructive sleep apnea purely as a result of a neurotoxic effect of the brainstem. And likewise, there are because the brainstem does so much. The brainstem is this miracle worker. It's like the operating system in a computer. Like it's doing all this stuff at kernel level that you don't know what it's doing. It's critical stuff. And if you mess with a kernel, if you mess with the underlying OS, hardware level, you're going to screw up your computer. And it's the same kind of thing. And it's almost impossible to recognize brainstem effects unless you have an encyclopedic knowledge of brainstem neuronet. And these things are not neurologists who are the experts in this area do not see disease entities that manifest in this way. And so this is not something neurologists recognize. The specialists that recognize it are the ENT docs, because they do occasionally see focal lesions in, for example, the vestibular nuclei contributing to balance problems. So in the event that your condition unfortunately affects your vestibular nuclei in the brainstem, you may have some pathognomonic findings, dizziness, and vertigo, and so on, that can be reliably and validly and specifically linked or referred back to your vestibular nuclei, which in this context can only be explained as a result of methylene poison, right? But I digress. My point is that there are any number of areas of the brainstem where if you kill a handful of neurons, well maybe a few handfuls of neurons, then you may have all manner of physical symptoms, ranging from dysautonomia to weird tingling sensations, to strange pain syndromes, to all sorts of strange gastrointestinal syndromes, strange speech problems, strange swallowing problems. And I've been reluctant to expand this list, but it very well could be that there are some links to autoimmune and hormonal type problems as well. The list is very long and will likely become longer in due course. And I tend not to focus on those because it's hard enough developing consensus on the very obvious neuropsychiatric effects of the drug. But just know that once the brainstem starts getting involved with things, then pretty much everything is on the table, right? Now, I mentioned I don't necessarily condone everything on this chart, but this is what veterans are noticing, right? And I see that too. I do see veterans, I do see associations where veterans who report certain neuropsychiatric symptoms that I think are very clearly causally due to mefloquine. I do see perhaps a preponderance of other physical symptoms that I'm not yet willing to confidently attribute to the drug, but which I will say it makes sense, it's plausible, right? So if you say, doc, is the reason I go to the bathroom all the time because of mefloquine? Well, I can't prove it. If I'm on the stand and the other side's grilling me, I might say, well, okay, I guess there might be other causes. Unlike the other effects where I'll say, no, there really isn't a plausible other cause. But in due course, who knows? We might learn a lot more. Yeah. So okay. So anyway, so getting back to the pathophysiology. So juvenile or pediatric seizure disorder was fairly effectively treated with a strict ketogenic diet. And in addition to this one case, I have heard a handful of other cases where similar effects have been reported. Now, I am not advocating that people get on a ketone diet for treatment of this condition. I'm not advocating this, right? But that being said, there are plenty of people that say, ketone diet, a ketonic diet, is healthy for a lot of reasons, right? It's not really a medical intervention, it's a lifestyle choice. And provided that you go see your doctor and your doctor doesn't have any problem with it, a lot of people are choosing to do it, and they're losing a lot of weight, and they're feeling great, and it's, on the whole, it's relatively harmless, compared to a lot of other options out there. And I can tell you my own personal experience, again, this is not about me and my experience with mefloquine. I don't think I've ever been affected by mefloquine significantly. Well, maybe my left ear, but that's another story. But I know I feel better. I just feel better. My brain is clear. I'm able to focus more. I enjoy life more when I'm in a state of strong ketosis. And I do occasionally like to eat junk food and go off the diet. Who doesn't? But I'm also eager to go back on because I just feel healthier. And my experience, many medical veterans feel the same way. Yeah.
Thank you. Do we have
I just wanted to ask a couple of you said Malarone was available in 2001.
Yes.
roughly, and
Well,
that,
so the question is, Malarone was available in 2001. It was available prior to that, but in 2001, by 2001, it was not only available pretty much everywhere, but it was also known with reasonable certainty that it was far better than Mefloquine from a side effect profile in particular.
yeah,
So the very latest militaries could have argued for the preferential use of Mefloquine without raising some other strange explanation was 2001. By 2001, really, everyone should have been preferring the use of Malarone, as they do now, very clearly prefer. But
and so say in '92 when the airborne deployed to Somalia, was there another an anti-malaria available?
oh yeah, so the question is, has there always been an alternative to Mefloquine? There's always been alternatives to Mefloquine. So yes, and of course, because pilots, obviously, from the earliest days, were told you can't take Mefloquine, right? So the real tragedy is we never needed, even if everything that I've been speculating about, all this weird, nefarious, government conspiracy stuff, even if all that's just not true, as coincidental as all this stuff is, even if that's not true, and they were just confused, and tragically mistaken for using Mefloquine. The tragedy is they never needed to use Mefloquine. There's no validity or merit at all to the argument that they had no choice, that they had to use Mefloquine. That is a completely bogus and fallacious argument. It holds no credibility at all. So when the U.S. Army, I believe in 2008 or 2009, as soon as Obama got elected, and they stopped using Mefloquine in Guantanamo, coincidentally, as soon as Obama was elected, the Army sent out a message saying, hey, Mefloquine, bad idea, you should be using doxycycline as your antimalarial of choice, right? So doxycycline is a broad-spectrum antibiotic that we give to a lot of soldiers anyway. It's kind of frontline treatment for some STDs. And I noticed when I was in the Army, we had a lot fewer patients at our STD clinic when we had them on doxycycline than when they were on other drugs, but that's beside the point. So there are lots of other reasons why you might want to prescribe doxycycline in a deployed environment, because not only is doxycycline very effective and reasonably well tolerated against malaria, but it also prevents a lot of other tropical diseases, including like Q fever, for example, which we're occasionally concerned about, as well as a lot of other stuff. So doxycycline is a great drug. No resistance has ever been reported. I don't think resistance will ever be reported to doxycycline. Knock on wood, and because it was the military's drug of choice after Mefloquine was removed, there's really no argument that it should have ever been, anything other than the drug of choice. And in fact, when Mefloquine was first licensed in the United States in 1989, the military, most branches of the military, and the military is relatively decentralized in its decision-making in this regard, but most branches of the military, most commands in the military said, we don't have a lot of experience with Mefloquine, we're going to continue using doxycycline. It's perfectly good. Nothing wrong with doxycycline, we're going to continue using it. And of course, we use doxycycline to great effect in Somalia. A lot of troops use doxycycline in Somalia. Not a big deal, right? It was fine. Some troops don't take it. They get malaria. We treat them. Problem solved. So it's really not that big of a deal. And of course, the first large-scale use of Mefloquine was in Somalia because I suspect, in retrospect, there was a lot of reluctance and ambivalence within the frontline military medical community about using Mefloquine. There are too many uncertainties, too many unknowns, too many concerns with the drug. There was a lot of apprehension. And I think the military was saying, you know what, no. We spent all this money developing the drug. We got these people at high levels telling us we need to start using the drug. So we're going to use Somalia as a proving ground. Someone said it earlier.
Yeah, that's
for Mefloquine. That's exactly right. You were essentially guinea pigs. They wanted to, they needed, and to what extent Canada participated in Somalia primarily for this purpose, is something worth looking into, because it is, in historical context, it is pretty odd, right? How eager Canada was. I know, my hat's starting to shine in the sunlight.
Shine like mine.
It's starting to sparkle. But they can't read my thoughts, so I'm good. For the reason people wear tinfoil hats is in the midst of their delusional paranoia, they think that the tinfoil hat will act as a Faraday cage, preventing the aliens or the intelligence agencies from using remote techniques to read the electrical activity generated by the brain. Which is actually true, right? Like if you isolate your brain in a Faraday cage, then they won't be able to use remote sensing because you actually can read people's thoughts now with remote imaging, right? With remote. So secret agents that are trying to elude detection, by counterintelligence forces might need to wear tinfoil hats in the future. But I'm digressing.
Another rabbit.
But-
Do you have any other?
We have to
So,
find out.
and,
Do we have any other questions?
Yeah.
I've been told we have to do.
Yeah, we do.
I got one more.
Yeah, go
Sorry.
please do. He's the boss.
But-
I mean,
And during the Vietnam War, was there an anti-malaria drug that was taken once a week?
Right. So, and I alluded to this earlier. So, Mefloquine is just the latest in a long line of Me Too drugs, right? So, Mefloquine is a quinoline drug. It functions primarily because it has at its core the quinoline moiety, quinoline nucleus. If you've seen our foundation's logo, it's quinoline. It's basically two benzenes together with a substituted nitrogen for a carbon. The quinoline, if you remember organic chemistry in college, it's very simple. The quinoline moiety, the quinoline core, has this remarkable property in that it gives the molecule that's built on it the ability to permeate across barrier membranes. So it's basically able to travel through walls inside the cell. It's able to permeate into the brain, trouble-free. It's just got a free pass. The brain, various organs have barrier membranes to try to keep the bad stuff out. It's generally a principle in biology. And up until recently, it was also recognized at the level of nation states and so on that in order to retain normal physiology, in order to stay alive, you need to control your borders, right? You need to keep certain things out and you need to keep certain things in. You need to have control over a certain volume of space. And so we have barrier membranes that do that. But there are always sneaky ways of getting around that. The quinoline moiety, the quinoline core, allows this drug to get around that. So it sneaks across the barrier membrane. It accumulates within the barrier membrane. It accumulates within the structure protected by the barrier membrane. And what ends up happening is it ends up being subtly modified by that environment and accumulate. And so Mefloquine and related drugs accumulate at many hundreds to 1,000-fold their concentration in certain parts of the cell and within the malaria parasite. So the reason Mefloquine and related quinolines work is because they accumulate at very high concentrations in the malaria parasite itself, where it kills the malaria parasite. Now that property also, I think, underlies its toxicity. That's why it probably gets into your brain in people who are susceptible and probably gets into certain parts of your brain where it exerts its neurotoxic effects. Okay, now Mefloquine is just the latest in a series, well, it's not the latest because it's a new one, but at the time it was the latest in a series of quinoline drugs dating back to the earliest colonial days. So all of these drugs are based on quinine, the naturally occurring extract of the cinchona bark, which was first isolated, which was first identified in the Western world by the Spaniards that went to South America. They brought quinine back, they brought cinchona bark back, the fever tree, and it allowed Western colonial expansion. If it weren't for quinine, we wouldn't have been able to colonize Africa, the West. The West wouldn't have been able to colonize that. The Romans never colonized Africa. Why? Because they would have died, right? From malaria. They didn't have quinine. But the reason the Brits and the Italians and the French were able to colonize Western Africa and South Africa and go on to colonize India is because they had magic quinine. They were drinking gin and tonics. And the quinine in the gin and tonics was enough of a schizonticide, the quinine was acting as a schizonticide, that it kept the malaria parasites at bay in their blood. And so, you were a British colonial officer, you were serving in sub-Saharan Africa, you would drink a couple of gin and tonics every day, and that would keep the malaria at bay for the most part, right? So that was the first quinoline anti-malarial. We used that in World War I. We used a related quinoline anti-malarial called quinacrine in World War II, Atabrine. We developed chloroquine during World War II. The Germans actually developed it, but we redeveloped it. and primaquine during World War II. And we used chloroquine and primaquine in the Korean War. We used chloroquine and primaquine in the Vietnam War. And the thing is, nothing that I've described here to do with mefloquine is really new. It might have been a subtle improvement on chloroquine in many ways, but chloroquine had similar effects. So I'm reasonably certain that, and just stepping back a little bit, you've all heard about Vietnam syndrome, have you? Vietnam syndrome. Vietnam Veterans of America, I think, Vietnam veterans, they, throughout the 60s and 70s, they became concerned because so many veterans were coming back from the Vietnam War with a weird constellation of signs and symptoms. These veterans were coming back angry. They were coming back mad. They were coming back anxious and paranoid, right? And, these were previously, just nice, regular people. They were coming back from Vietnam raging, right? It's kind of where the whole guys gone postal syndrome came from. And they said, look, the psychiatrists don't understand what's wrong with it. And if you look at the original description of Vietnam syndrome, it was a lot more neurological. There were a lot more neurological symptoms, and there were even some gastrointestinal symptoms thrown in there too. It was a strange constellation of signs and symptoms that hadn't previously been seen. And so the psychiatrists, and of course it was predominantly psychiatric, but the psychiatrists had no idea what was going on. And so they basically just said, well, you're crazy, I can't help you. And increasingly the psychiatry community began to realize, okay, we actually have a problem on our hands. But it took the better part of 15 years. And finally, in 1980, the American Psychiatric Association, with the approval of the VA, they had been meeting, trying to deal with this. But they basically came out after a period of discussion and said, fine, we're going to give this thing a name. We're going to call it post-traumatic stress disorder. 1980. Prior to that, there wasn't post-traumatic stress disorder. It didn't exist. Didn't exist. And so all of these signs and symptoms that had been previously attributed to this complex multi-system disorder known informally as Vietnam syndrome, which had neurological and physical manifestations, became simplified into this sort of purely psychiatric thing that was attributed to the effects of trauma. And a pathophysiology was proposed that postulated, well, exposure to extreme levels of stress triggered some sort of permanent change in the amygdala, hippocampus, and that led to all of these symptoms. And maybe that's true. There's pretty good evidence in support of that. My point in all of this is that the population of patients that originally informed the original diagnostic criteria for post-traumatic stress disorder and the original impetus even for the diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder being acknowledged was a group of veterans that had likely been regularly taking chloroquine and primaquine, which are structurally related to mefloquine and which can have relatively comparable effects. And that raises the question, a reasonable question, is it possible that at least some of the disease burden that led to post-traumatic stress disorder being recognized as an entity, is it possible that at least some of that was actually caused by earlier drugs of this class? And if so, how confused and how confounded is the literature on post-traumatic stress disorder? And I'm on record as saying that in due course, once the psychiatric community, primarily the psychiatric community, recognizes that mefloquine encephalopathy is a thing, and that it causes most of these symptoms in the blue chart, once it acknowledges that and recognizes that in all of the studies of post-traumatic stress disorder, most of which have involved troops going to war, that most of these studies and most of the critical studies, which have been primarily responsible for this disease entity coming into existence, all these studies have been hopelessly confounded by the potential effects of mefloquine. And it would not surprise me at all if we had to throw out, literally throw out, the entire body of literature on this disorder, because it's all hopelessly confounded from birth. It would be as if the babies got switched at birth in the hospital, and you're raising a child that's not your own, right? And then 20 years later, you realize, wait a second, this is not my son. This is not my daughter. That's basically what we're dealing with here. The possibility that when we fully acknowledge the depth and severity of this confounding, that the psychiatric community will have to say, you know what, all these studies are all wrong. they're invalid. Which is another reason why there's likely so much reluctance, and because people have built their entire careers on saying these soldiers came back from Vietnam, and the reason they've been experiencing these horrific nightmares and this awful anxiety and is because, well, you know, early on they might have said, well, they probably had bad relationships with their mother, they had attachment issues, and you know, there's probably some sexual tension there with their sister or something, you know, just some crazy Freudian nonsense. But I don't like Freud very much, as you can.
No, obviously.
Yeah, she's quack. But my point is that I've just lost half the psychiatry community by saying that. Fraser, I guess I lost him. But
You lost
but my point is that there are people who base their entire careers on this, right?
Yeah.
And they're not going to go silently into the night. I've said that science progresses one funeral at a time, right? So do not take that the wrong way.
Yeah.
Okay. But my point is that they're never going to change their mind.
Until they have.
They're never going to change their mind. You'd like to think that science progresses by, you know, people willingly trying to disprove their theory and willingly hoping that the thing that they've studied their whole life and that they base their career on, a good scientist would say, I hope somebody proves me wrong, because then the world would be even more interesting than I thought it was. Unfortunately, humans being humans, that's not how scientists are, with some exceptions. Good scientists like Feynman, in particular, Einstein in particular, good scientists love to be proven wrong. They would love nothing more to be proven wrong. But most academics who are struggling to pay the bills do not want to be proven wrong, because then the money runs out, right? So and then they get fired, they don't get promoted. So it's very unlikely that the psychiatry community is just going to willingly accept this scenario, right? Because it would be too uncomfortable for the practical day-to-day existence of psychiatrists. But in due course, a new generation will come into the field, and they will base their career on questioning this, exploring this, you know, identifying the inconsistencies in the literature. And they will see that they can make a career questioning the orthodoxy. How long will this take? Take a little longer. That's not going to be the catalyst. The catalyst for that happening will be some other, you know, acknowledgement that this is a problem. And then in due course, the new generation of psychiatrists will say, wait a second, there's more to PTSD than meets the eye. Maybe we should look into this drug that was given to these troops during the early years of the diagnoses development. Yeah, so to answer your question, yes, there was a drug similar to Mefloquine used in prior wars. And in fact, the number of wars that the US military has fought where a quinoline drug has not been widely used, you can count on one hand, right? The Gulf War is the one where you really didn't have a lot of Mefloquine use. Pretty much every other deployment, there was a large-scale use of one or more quinoline drugs. And what is the one conflict where we haven't seen a lot of PTSD? What's the one conflict where there isn't a whole lot of PTSD? The Gulf War. There's really not a whole lot of PTSD associated with the Gulf War. There's a lot of PTSD associated with the Somalia deployment. There's a lot of PTSD associated with various special forces deployments. A lot of PTSD associated with the Iraq and Afghanistan deployments. But there's not a lot of PTSD associated with the Persian Gulf War. Instead, you have a different syndrome associated with Persian Gulf War, which in retrospect is plausibly attributable to other exposures that were, you know, experienced by folks there. Yeah, interesting.
Very interesting.
Okay. I'm gonna.
So were the drugs that were available during Vietnam, were they once a week or once a
Oh,
month?
I'm sorry. I never answered your question. So. Well, chloroquine is a once-a-week drug.
Oh, it is once a week?
Today it's dosed once a week, but there are different ways of giving the drug. Like you can formulate chloroquine with primaquine to be given more frequently than once a week. But chloroquine is typically given once a week. Mefloquine is typically given once a week.
Yeah.
Quinaquine or Adabrin was typically given daily. Quinine you take a couple times a day. You know, you have your gin and tonic at lunch, you have your gin and tonic at nighttime or two. Right.
Oh, perfect.
Okay.
It's true, it's still.
I am going to wrap it up. It's been my absolute privilege and honor to participate and facilitate this conversation with someone with your incredible expertise, and I've really enjoyed it. And share.